Thanks for listening to The Breakdown and subscribing to The Australian. It is the support of subscribers like you that allows us to bring you this podcast. As well as the exclusive first access to episodes, your subscription means you can stay up to date with the latest developments at theaustralian.com.au/thebreakdown. When you first sort of walked in and saw the books, and everything, what did you think?
It was a mess.
This is Hamish McLennan, the former boss of Channel 10 and the newest chair of Rugby Australia, the man they are hoping will steer the game out of financial chaos.
There were a couple of moments there where I was very concerned that if we didn't pull out what we had to do, then the whole game would have collapsed. And Rob Clark and I were talking about, with the board, one scenario is that the game devolves to being amateur again. And that was a real possibility. So it was a little bit like a video game where the canyons behind you collapse every step that you take. And so thankfully we were able to just sort of shore it up and then navigate a pathway through it. But it really did feel like Indiana Jones at one point.
So it was that touch and go?
Oh, it was absolutely, and history will prove that that was the case. Those who know the detail, it was pretty tricky.
The game was on the precipice of collapse and becoming amateur again. Just 17 years after a $40 million windfall, crowds nudging 100,000, 3 million TV viewers, a code that was taking it right back up to rugby league, poaching their superstar players. Well, they were facing oblivion. The fact is, players at the Waratahs, Brumbies, Rebels, the Force and the Reds were on the brink of not being paid as professionals anymore. They were going to be amateur. No TV deal means no broadcast revenue. That's what pays Super Rugby wages. This is episode 6 of The Breakdown. What now? In this episode, we explore Rugby Australia's current state and the ailing state of the game at its grassroots. More on that later in the episode. But first, when McLennan first walked into Rugby Australia's Moore Park office, he said the place was like a war zone. In 2020, there was carnage in the boardroom. The former chair, Paul McLean, had handed over to McLennan, but not before the Rugby Australia board had split into factions. One board member quit. There was talk of the old guard who'd overseen rugby in that golden era, well, that they'd be back. It was suggested that Matt Carroll should be CEO, that John O'Neill may join the board, and so much more. I could spend an entire episode going through it all. There's a real state versus state conflict beneath the surface in rugby, and it's causing all types of grief. A bunch of Queenslanders felt the push to oust Raelene Castle was driven by New South Wales people. The Queenslanders didn't like it. Gary Flowers, the chief executive who ran the game from 2004 to 2007, points out that the infighting and the chaos has been going on for a very long time.
Well, yeah, and look, rugby's shown a great propensity to devour its own, like no other. Probably not that dissimilar to what I recall in the bad old days of soccer or football. Early in the piece, it was just a conga line of people that kept on being devoured by the system. I mean, you've only got to look at the fact that probably Rob Clark's the only CEO in the last 20 plus years that's moved on from his own volition. So, and the other stat that I'll give you, which is an interesting one, in my tenure of just under 4 years at rugby, I had 4 chairmen and 23 board members in that period. How can you have any continuity or consistency? I mean, and you look at Rugby Inc., which in those days was around about a $200 million a year business. If you've added it all up, it's obviously probably less than that now. But you had, multiplicity of boards and chairmen and presidents and CEOs, and, you would not design a business like that to be able to allow it to function in this modern day. So yeah, I think that's a huge issue for the game. And
in the last 25 years, Australian rugby has had 11 chairmen. There are some who believe the way rugby is governed at the moment needs to be blown up. The constitution of the game gives extra voting rights to the states with lots of registered players. That means New South Wales and Queensland get more votes than the other states. And like everything else in Australian politics, it leaves the rest of the country feeling overlooked and deeply annoyed. Andrew Forrest, who's not just a billionaire rugby fan, but also a very proud West Australian, well, he's sick and tired of the eastern states hogging the ball. He wants constitutional reform.
Bring in a new constitution which doesn't allow most of the competition between the states to be off the field, which will encourage all the competition to be on the field and the states to take their dutiful roles as supporting the national game, but not at the expense of governance, supporting their state, but not at the expense of the national game and not at the expense of governance.
There's another governance question. How do you even get on the board? There's a nominations committee that puts names up to the chairman, who then gets to choose. Alan Jones, a former Wallabies coach and a vocal critic of the game's failings, reckons that's a good place to start if you want to shake things up.
It's a secret society. It's like the bloody Freemasons. You almost got to knock on the door to see if you can get in. And, you know, the tent's locked and no one's got a key.
Anne Sherry, who was on the board for 7 years, sounds frustrated about the way the game is run. She thinks that things have improved, but not enough.
So it needs a constitutional resolution. Otherwise, it distracts and it diverts a lot of money. It's money and control. You know, in the smallest of the codes of football, we replicate 5-6 times everything we do because nobody really wants to be under a national umbrella. They want their own everything, and that's one of the pressures on the cost structure of rugby is that everything is replicated, and often not that efficiently, and often not that well. So if you're trying to run a game where most of the money for the total game comes from the big national teams and big international events, the fact that State A, State B and State C have completely different ways of training is a problem. And, you know, completely different mindsets about player preparation and the physical preparation. And those were issues that we were constantly facing into with not having national teams match fit. You know, there's been plenty written about this. So we saw teams struggling to really play well because of the way they were prepared. They were all prepared differently. And those issues are also not sustainable. So it's, you know, that piece, I guess that is ego. You know, that's ego at a state level, saying we can do it better than everyone else, even though we've got less money.
Nick Farr-Jones says there needs to be an AFL-style commission, a single national body independent of the clubs and the states, making decisions on the future of the game. A commission would see the game run more like a business and do away with the ridiculous state politics.
One of the biggest problems is we've got a federated model, and again it comes down to power, and there's perhaps one or two chairmen of some of the major member unions that aren't prepared to give up that power. But what you need is a corporate type constitution or a commission like the AFL has. There's no doubt about that. It will come, but some of the current leaders of player unions have got votes, and I think you need 75% of the voting members to change the constitution. And so maybe one or two of those people need to move on, and we'll get a refreshment of the corporate structure of the game.
Okay, I think it's time to talk about the phrase, go woke, go broke.
You can go woke and go broke.
Many people think that it was Rugby Australia's push for diversity, the cutting of Israel Folau, as one of the main reasons that the game went broke. But the truth is the game was stuffed long before Izzy came along. The self-interest that has dominated the code has been its undoing. And it's very important to note that the game was recording deficits before the Folau drama. Back in 2017, the game recorded an operational deficit of $3.8 million. When the 2019 books were finally revealed in mid-last year, they were shocking. There had been years of overstaffing and overspending, which included officials often flying first class.
I think Rugby Australia's 2020 financial report is one of the worst I've ever seen.
John Stensolt is the Australian's award-winning business writer, and one of our producers, Eric George, interviewed him for this podcast.
The fact that they couldn't get their accountants to sign it off for many months is staggering. It's an indictment on their financial state that the game's found itself in. I just couldn't believe it when I saw it, when we revealed what they looked like, when they finally lobbed to ASIC. It was late May. They struck a series of last-minute deals to remain solvent and to get those accounts signed off. We're talking, they made a $9.4 million loss, but they had to, make a series of undertakings to get the balance sheet approved by their auditors. They had to strike deals with World Rugby to get money from there. They had to sort out a $6 million loan with HSBC to remain in the financial game, so to speak. There's a lot of big issues that are at play. They've had to cut a lot of costs out. They've had to sign a television deal that's worth less than the one they've had for the last several years. There's still a huge amount of question marks over rugby going forward. What it means is the books were so bad that the auditors were worried that rugby didn't have enough money to keep going into next year and beyond.
So Rugby Australia is not out of the woods. The player drain is well advanced. Rich foreign clubs are still on the hunt for Australia's international class players. A few players, including Wallabies, have already taken overseas contracts in Japan and Europe. Some, like Wallabies captain Michael Hooper, are taking sabbaticals as allowed in their contracts. Others, like young Wallaby Isaac Rodder, who used to play for the Queensland Reds, were publicly shamed for going overseas. Now, in Rodder's case, we can reveal he actually wanted to remain here in Australia, but internal politics stopped him. That is, the RA board blocked him from going to another Australian Super Rugby team. He had no choice but to go overseas because he no longer wanted to be at the Reds. So Rodder, one of the players who is integral to the Wallabies' success as a world-class lock, has been shut out of the game here because of internal politics. There's a long list of Wallabies overseas, no longer playing in the local comp. Players like Samu Karevi, Liam Gill, Harry Hawkins, Adam Coleman, Kurtley Beale and Quade Cooper. I've been told there are other Wallabies thinking about leaving Australia to get a better deal for themselves overseas. I'm just going to read an excerpt from a report talking about this very issue. Rugby either pays its top players well or it loses most of them. If it loses them, it loses the ability to provide mass entertainment. It loses the heroes and the public status that encourage other serious players and which draw youngsters into the game. That report I just read from was written by Dr. Michael Crawford back in 1996. Here's former CEO John O'Neill. He commissioned that report.
And great truism in all sport, but particularly in rugby, whoever owns the players owns the game. And the players will go where the money is. And we've just got to be careful, I'm not telling anyone how to suck eggs, that we may run the risk of ending up like soccer, like football, where all the best players play in the centre of the soccer universe, which is the UK and Europe.
And these days, the kids who are great at rugby union, you'll probably find them in rugby league. It's the 80s all over again, but not in a good way.
Can I get a quick read from you on this Joseph Suaalii?
Now, Vonnie, imagine being 16 and seeing your face on the back of, newspapers across a couple of states, being talked about on talkback radio, being offered ridiculous amounts of money across a couple of codes. How would you handle it?
Oh, wouldn't it just be a mind-boggling experience? You're obviously talking about Joseph Suaalii there.
Joseph Suaalii is a Western Sydney teenager. He's one of the most exceptional footy talents in recent years. He has been schooled at King's. Suaalii was at the centre of a huge fight between rugby union and rugby league for his signature. It was rumoured that Rugby Union threw $3 million at the kid. That was repeatedly denied by Rugby Australia. Here is Fox League's Yvonne Sampson on Sky Sports Radio last year.
Now, the problem is he can't play NRL until August next year when he turns 18, but far and away, all the experts and Loz, I heard you talking about him earlier, they say he is ready for NRL. He is one of the most gifted athletes we've ever seen. But the conundrum is that do you take the $3 million on offer from Rugby Australia, which I just have to say, that I don't know, they say it's being backed by sort of wealthy third-party conglomerate, but Rugby Australia is in $20 million debt. So I don't know if that money actually exists or whether they will be able to honour such an incredible amount to Joseph Suaalii. South have offered him a 1.7 3-year deal, so it's basically half of it. Russell Crowe has hosted Joseph and his family up at his property at Manor Glen, just trying to get him across the line. But Tim Horan, as we know, former Wallaby and Queensland Red, he's saying that rugby offers more than just the cash. It's the opportunity to play for the Wallabies and the prestige that goes along with that and travelling around the world. And he had a bit of a dig at the NRL saying, it's better than running around Wollongong and Campbelltown week in, week out, which I thought, that you can leave that bit out because I think in terms of a career and professional satisfaction, you've definitely got to, this is a life-changing decision, but you've got to weigh up what makes you happy. Joseph comes from a large family. One of his siblings is, obviously needs a little bit more special care. So money is tight in the Suaalii family, so you could never begrudge him for taking such a huge offer that would change his life and that of his family's. But yeah, it's very interesting, and it's a huge conundrum for a 16-year-old to have.
Suaalii said no to rugby and no to South Sydney. South thought they'd locked up his signature with a lot of cash as a junior. Not even a private trip to the farm owned by superstar actor and South's co-owner Russell Crowe with some quad biking thrown in could keep Suaalii at South. It was the eastern suburbs powerhouse club, the Roosters, run by businessman Nick Politis, which outfoxed everyone and got Suaalii. It wasn't just about the money. At the Roosters, under coach Trent Robinson, Suaalii would be part of a highly professional culture. The Roosters have snapped up union schoolboy stars before. Souths too have recruited kids from traditional rugby union schools. Rabbitoh turned Rooster Angus Crichton, well, he was a 2-time Australian schoolboy. He was one of them. Here's Angus on the Hello Sport podcast. He's talking to a bunch of old Scots boys here who host this show. And Angus is talking about how the Waratahs stuffed up his recruitment and why he went to Souths on a contract worth just $15,000. Just a warning, the language is a little salty.
There was a chance of you sort of going to the Waratahs, eh?
Yeah, well,
and they offered you like some 5-year bullshit development
so
deal?
I actually never... I probably wouldn't have spoken to League if I had an offer from the Waratahs or an offer from Union.
Was there zero approach from Rugby Union at all? Or was it that they offered you some bullshit deal?
No, so I sat down with them and they just said, we can't offer you any full-time training. They said to me, we can't really see you playing first grade until you're around 23. You will come and play in our...
How old are you now?
22. Yes, they said.
It has proved to be the right move. Angus played first grade with Souths as an 18-year-old and he won a premiership with the Roosters in 2019. No doubt Suaalii will be wanting to do the same with the Eastern Suburbs Club. Word is the 17-year-old has been training the house down at the Roosters and they are pushing for him to debut sooner rather than later. Brad Fittler likes the look of Suaalii. He's included him in the New South Wales State of Origin emerging Blues side. The Suaalii thing, this is not a one-off. It's not a near miss for rugby, like we missed out this time. I've spoken to a number of player agents and a couple of rugby league footy managers, and they say league now has first go at all the best junior footy talent in the land. It's obvious that rugby's grip on private schools is weakening. Here's Alan Jones.
And you go to the GPS schools now, and if you will go into the King's School or whatever, these used to be the breeding grounds of our international players, and you go to the King's School and there's AFL posts up everywhere, there are soccer nets everywhere, and I've got to wander around and do a cross-country before I can find a rugby paddock. So we've lost our base. But I've always said, and no one in Australian rugby listens to me, and perhaps they shouldn't, but I've always said that the rugby family is like a home. Now, if you build a home and spend all your money on the roof and nothing on the floor, the home will collapse. So we're spending a fortune on all these players at the top. They've got big contract, $1 million here, $800 there. Nothing in the schools. Nothing on the clubs, nothing on the subbies.
There's a really prestigious Sydney school called Newington. The first question many prospective parents ask now is, do you have AFL? David Campese recently tried to hand out free tickets for a big rugby match to a group of 40 boarders at Cranbrook School in Sydney's east. What happened next was a concern, but not a surprise.
So I rang New South Wales Rugby and I said, listen, can I get some tickets? My son goes to Cranbrook.
Yeah.
And I just want to see if some of the boarders want to go out. I think there's about 30, 40 boarders there. 7 kids wanted to go. It's a rugby school, 7 kids.
Phil Kearns says rugby just doesn't have the money to compete.
As much as they try, we just don't have the resources. When you look at $2.5 billion as a TV deal for AFL and, we've just done a $100 million deal over 3 years, there's a big difference in that volume of money. So we certainly have lost that connection, and that's just not financially, it's also emotionally, because the perception, and sometimes, well, as you know, perception becomes reality. The perception from the regions and from the clubs is that they have been forgotten. So, yeah, there has been that loss.
Here's John Eales.
Yeah, no, if people sort of are in charge of the books for a lot of these times, and they've got to make the decisions over, where do you spend your limited resources with these things? Like, you cannot stop every young player going to rugby league, every young talented player going to rugby league or to AFL. So, you have to, be creative. You need to instill a love of the game in these people. You need to instill, a seed of desire, saying, I want to represent Australia at a World Cup. I want to represent the Wallabies. And we can still do that.
The battle for the hearts and minds of kids at the grassroots, that has been where rugby union has really let itself down. It's hard to get an accurate read on participation statistics. It's an open secret that codes often fudge them, so we have to go anecdotally. Claire and I can speak to this issue. We have 4 kids between us. We've seen the junior sports arms race firsthand. So I was at school drop-off this morning and I was talking to a dad in the playground, and he was a great rugby union player, and our kids actually play rugby league together. And I thought that was really interesting, and I was asking him why he hadn't put his son into rugby union. And he said to me, it feels like they don't want our kids, that they are solely focused on the GPS kids. Our kids go to a public school.
Wow. My kids go to a public school too, and this is in Sydney's southeast, which is the territory of the Ella brothers. A whole lot of other great Wallabies came from that part of town. But again, rugby union hasn't come looking for our kids. I don't know any kids in our local area who play rugby union. My son plays AFL, and he's not going to be a Sydney Swan, but AFL wants him anyway. They're giving us season passes to the Swans. They're inviting the little boys to come and bring the ball onto the game for the Swans at the SCG. It's the full experience. It's not very expensive to join. It feels like they want not just little players, they want families, they want fans, they want volunteers. And it's a really nice experience. We love going to the games, even though we're not particularly AFL fans. So it just doesn't feel to me as though rugby's anywhere in that competition.
Yeah, I think they're just not, to be frank. I mean, I look around our neighbourhood, I can't see a single sort of banner saying where this is where you should enrol your kid to play rugby union. I couldn't even tell you our local rugby union club. It's a worry.
And that's funny, isn't it? Because you and I have both covered rugby union. We're interested in the sport.
Yeah.
We know a lot of rugby union players. We'd both be inclined to do it if only the opportunity was there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at the Wallabies, they've got a pretty sparkling off-field reputation at the moment. And you can't say the same for some other codes. And I think that there's a real opportunity lost right now. Phil Kearns, who grew up and played rugby union in southern Sydney's rugby league heartland, says he is shattered by what he has seen happen to the grassroots.
I played for the Blakehurst Blues and my club no longer exists. But neither in my area does the Oatley team doesn't exist. The Cars Park Royals don't exist. Rockdale don't exist anymore. I think there's only one team down there called Burraneer. God bless them. And I think there might be, aside from the Sylvania Bulldogs, it still may exist. But so of all those clubs, they're gone. So for me, that's incredibly sad to see that. So in terms of a World Cup job, I'd love to see us rejuvenate our code down in those areas.
Kearns is leading the 2027 World Cup bid. He says reviving the suburban and bush nurseries is crucial to the game's survival. Stephen Moore is a former Wallabies captain. He led the team to the final of the World Cup in 2015, and he grew up in the bush, in Mount Morgan in central Queensland. Back when Stephen was a kid, the Reds would travel up to play exhibition matches in nearby Rockhampton, and that's what inspired him to be a Wallaby.
Look, rugby was very strong back then. This is in the mid to late 80s, so rugby was very strong. The Reds used to come and play in Rocky quite regularly against visiting invitational sides, and you look at the Central West areas like Longreach and Blackall, and then further down the Darling Downs, Toowoomba, Condamine, Dalby, all those places were big rugby areas, and that's probably been lost a little bit. That's probably regressed, and not to say other sports have taken over, but I just don't think it has that same presence that it had back then for one reason or another. So that's a real worry, because if you look back through the history, some of our greatest players have come from the bush, and and large numbers of them. So it's an important breeding ground for rugby at the community level, for participation of kids, and rugby played a big role in the bush, and we need to make sure we maintain that. But for some reason, I think we probably haven't had the funding to allocate to bush, to rural regional rugby, or we've allocated it in other areas. And it's important that we try and resurrect that. And I know the Classic Wallabies, who I'm closely involved with, are doing a lot of great things out in the bush. We're playing games out there. We're going out doing coaching clinics and trying to revive rugby a little bit out in those regions, because it is a critical part of rugby. Because if there is a criticism of the game, it is that rugby is an elitist sport that's confined to private schools in Brisbane and Sydney, right? So, I mean, how often do you hear that all the time? And it's not true, and it shouldn't be true, but we need to keep working on that too, because at the moment we're not doing enough.
One of rugby's heartlands, the Central West competition in New South Wales, sums up the decline of the game. The Central West comp used to field 14 teams in 1999. In 2013, they had 9 seriously struggling clubs, and last season, they had 6. How would you describe where the game is at the Grassroots, where you are in Bundaberg at the moment? How would you describe it?
Catastrophic at the moment.
And then there's Country Queensland. This is Jeff Messett.
Currently I'm secretary of our club in Bundaberg, Falcons, the Ways Falcons Rugby Union Club. However, I have done everything from president to water boy in the club.
There's a lot of Jeffs in Australia, passionate rugby people who are busting a gut to make their local club work. But they are frustrated at every turn at what they see as needless bureaucracy, aggressive competition from other codes, shrinking volunteer numbers, and a disconnect with the head office.
I think the pyramid model is upside down. I think they should be focusing on the grassroots and community rugby, where it's the engine room. Because if you take the bottom of the pyramid away, it all falls down.
This pyramid that Jeff's at the bottom of, that's Rugby Australia. The Wallabies, board infighting, state versus state, all the stuff we've been talking about for the past 5 episodes. When the Wallabies are winning, kids want to play rugby union. They join a local club, they pay membership dues, mum and dad take them to the club games or to see the Waratahs, the Reds, the Force. They buy merchandise. They watch rugby on TV and the ratings skyrocket, meaning broadcasters pay big bucks for the rights. And the money is ploughed back into the grassroots so every kid has a great experience. So if none of that is happening, where does that leave Jeff? When you start seeing teams drop off, going from a competition of 6 to 4, well, from 12 to 6 to 4, then you know the game's in trouble, right?
Yep. Yeah, and that's what's happened. As I said here, we lost 3 teams in the last 2 years. They made a makeshift team, but it just keeps, games being forfeited and not enough players. They have 50. You have myself, a 50-year-old, trying to make up numbers just to get teams on the paddock. It's not in a good state.
New Rugby Australia chair Hamish McLennan acknowledges that the game can be criticised as being too elitist.
I think the perception's real. I don't think it's necessarily reflective of where we're at the moment. If you think of, the huge island population that's made such a great contribution to Australia and our teams, then they're not necessarily private school kids. We've sourced a lot of kids, young, men out of suburban schools in, Sydney and Brisbane. There's always been a good influx of players from country areas who didn't go to private schools. But the perception is that the cornerstone of it, I guess, is, a strong private school patronage. And I do think that we need to make it broader than that. I do think that leads some quarters to say it is elitist. And again, as I say, it's actually not the case in reality, but we do need to move away from that.
But back to the books. Since McLennan's arrival, they've cut costs at head office. They had to. McLennan's first move was to hire a man who goes by the name of Chainsaw. Chainsaw is Andrew Fulsham, and he is the COO of Rugby Australia. In the last couple of months, he's slashed something like $30 million out of the head office. Rugby Australia has gone from having just over 200 staff to just over 100. But the game wasn't only a financial basket case, it was also an emotional mess. This is McLennan again.
But everyone was unhappy. And so you walk into a situation like that where ex-players, there was the captain's letter, the fan base, players were worried about what their careers were going to look like. I talked a lot to Justin Harrison too, so he was representing all the professional players at the time. The board was a little bit wobbly. The staff at RA didn't know what was going to happen, and as it turned out, we just had to brutally take cost out, which was very difficult. And so, it's sort of familiar territory for me because I've had to do that before, but it was tough, and it was tough because it was so public, and so there were leaks going on at RA. Everyone, really, at the end of the day, wants rugby to succeed, but it was really important that we stop the hemorrhaging.
I asked McLennan what the game's greatest flaw has been.
That's an awesome question. I think the culture of rugby is really interesting. I think it's created a culture of entitlement over the years, and I wouldn't say snobbery by any stretch of the imagination, but probably complacency. And it's a hard thing to articulate, but whilst it's broadly played in country areas and suburban stadiums, there's also that sort of private school element. And I don't think successive management regimes were aggressive enough or fully understood what was happening out there with rugby league and AFL. And it was all a bit sleepy, but lovely people who've been involved in rugby, people who are high quality, but I just think they lost sight of what it takes to compete and win. And I think took for granted the heritage that we had. So forward planning, resources, investment in the game didn't happen adequately. And look, history does prove that. Look at where we're at the moment. So it took us many years to get into this situation. It'll take us many years to get out.
Let's be honest, rugby union is at the bottom of the pile. It ranks behind league, Aussie rules, cricket, netball and soccer. They're all ahead. Over the course of this podcast, a lot of people have told me rugby should just be a niche sport, that it shouldn't be aiming so high, that the heights of the 90s and early 2000s are just done and dusted. It's not worth trying to emulate that time. Andrew Forrest thinks differently.
This game could be as popular as the AFL. It needs to change. It needs to have visionary leaders, it needs to have a new constitution, and it needs to build it from the grassroots. We will never create one of the most popular sports in Australia just by backing the most senior talent and by taxing the grassroots. We've got to build it as the Aussie rules has done, as soccer's done, from the grassroots up, and have the vision to be patient and have the character strength to have the vision.
Way back in episode 2, we heard from Matt Rogers, the rugby league star who switched to rugby in the glory days. He reckons Australia can no longer sustain the number of elite teams we've got.
The struggle with Australian rugby over the last 10 years has just been this is what I believe, we've diluted our product so much that there's just been no pressure at those club levels for people to keep their position. I would love to see Australia back to, I mean, this will upset people, but I would love to see Australia back to 3 teams. The Brumbies, the Reds, the Waratahs. You've got 3 rock-solid teams that are playing at a very high level with 2 fly-halves in every team, 6 flankers in every team, 4 locks in every team who can all play well enough to make that team. You know, that's going to enhance the level of play, enhance the standard of play, that in turn then feeds into our national side that, becomes better and stronger because there's so much competition for those spots. If there's no competition and you're not fighting for anything, then what's the point? It's sort of it makes our sport or makes our game lesser to. I mean, it just doesn't strengthen it. Doesn't have the game's not improving. The players aren't improving because they don't have to.
Rogers also made this interesting observation.
I mean, they've got a lot of smart minds in there, a lot smarter than me. Sometimes I think that we forget what the number one marketing tool is, sir. And the number one marketing tool is winning, and you've got to win at all costs. Not at all costs, but not through cheating or doing something underhanded. But moral victories don't count in professional sport. Oh, we played well, we were close. It doesn't count. Nobody cares about that. Tomorrow they read the paper and you're lost. And I just think the emphasis and the focus on winning hasn't been great enough. I mean, it's just not enough to be good. And to say, oh, we tried our best. Well, your best isn't good enough, so you've got to find out how to make it better.
The Wallabies have just had their worst season since 1967. Last year, they finished ranked 7th in the world, their lowest ranking ever. In late 2018, Rugby Australia announced the creation of a new national high-performance system topped by a new coaching director earning more than $500,000. This was one of Raelene Castle's signature policies. She believed the old system, where the Wallabies coach was at the top of the pile, meant the other parts of the game, like Super Rugby and Rugby Sevens, played second fiddle. It cost a bomb, and when Scott Johnson was made coaching director, it was a clear blow to Michael Checker's authority. Checker quit when the Wallabies were knocked out of the quarterfinals at the 2019 World Cup, and on the way out he said he had no relationship with Raelene Castle. But what about the players' role in all of this? Here's former Wallaby captain Stephen Moore.
We can only control what happens inside those white lines, and we haven't taken ownership and responsibility of that as a playing group enough over the last 20 years. And you can look everywhere else you want, but the players on the field, and I was one of them, didn't do enough to get the outcomes we wanted. Sometimes we got close, right? For a long part of my career, we were second in the world, and we competed with the All Blacks, and we regularly had victories against South Africa and some of the other top sides, but we didn't do enough to get to be the best in the world. And that's what Australians expect of their sporting teams. They want us to be the best in the world, and we've been there before. So it's not like it's the first time it would ever happen. We have been the best in the world in rugby, and we can get there again. But I think it's important that players understand their role in that and the power that they have to determine the outcome. So I think we don't need to look to other people to give us the answers. And sure, you need a good board and a good CEO, and you need sponsors and revenue to generate things you want to do and pay for things. But it's incumbent on the people actually on the field to take complete ownership of the outcome.
Oh yeah, and what about the rules of the game? do they make the game boring? Does anyone actually understand or know all of the rules?
Jess, that's the laws of the game.
Yeah, sorry, the laws. Yes. Former ARU boss Gary Flowers has this to say.
I mean, you've always got to have two QCs arguing for days about the interpretation of what happens in a mall. And look, it's interesting, people have said to me that actually that rugby and AFL have certain fundamental things in common in that they both throughout the game have legitimate contests for possession, which is what makes those games really attractive because there's some spontaneity around it. It's just that they deal with it in totally different ways. AFL has no laws and rugby has A, it slows the game down. B, it means that people can't understand it. It's too difficult and complicated. Even people who have been rugby diehards for eons will argue the toss over this or that. Now, but whilst for some people that provides an interest in itself, yeah. And look, I think we don't want to ruin the fundamental values of the game. I mean, there are some things about the game which are fundamental to it, such as a game for all shapes and sizes. There are legitimate contests for possession throughout the game. They need to be maintained, but spending 10 or 12 minutes in a game resetting scrum after scrum after scrum is, I don't believe, advancing the game.
So why don't they just change the laws?
We have a problem that the Northern Hemisphere people run the game. They don't give a shit about the Southern Hemisphere. Couldn't give a stuff. And they run it totally.
This is David Leckie, one of Australia's most revered TV executives. He ran the Nine Network in the 1990s and Channel 7 during the 2000s and was intimately involved in the broadcast of both rugby league and Australian rules. He's also a lifelong rugby fan. He publicly called for Raylene Castle to stand aside when she was running the code. Now he says if they don't fix the laws of the game, they'll never get another lucrative TV deal.
So you go to Northern Ireland and it's all very good. But if you're not fucking around the table in Northern Ireland, you have no say. And there's no doubt for the kids coming through, for anybody coming through on this sport, it's impossible to understand. I mean, the rules have got, all the rules, the new rules they've got are dreadful. And, the ruck and maul stuff, oh, please. So sick of scrum, so sick of line-out. They've got to do something really radical. If they can get New Zealand on board, maybe they will. Might change, but I don't think it's going to. I think it's, at this stage, I put it as not much of a chance. And that's the problem. The rule is where it all starts and finishes.
I asked David Campese if the rules were making rugby too boring.
Well, I think you've got to understand in Australia we've got rugby league, Aussie rules, rugby union, football and cricket, 5. South Africa, you've got soccer, rugby, cricket. England, you've got rugby, rugby league a bit up the north, and cricket and soccer. So in our country, we've got so many different sports. And if you think about Melbourne, you get 100,000 people to go and watch a grand final. And I think it was back in the 90s, I think there was a grand final that was drew one week. They came back for another and it was another 100,000. So they made $43 million 2 weekends in a row. 100 million. They can, because they can do that. The laws are, in Australia, Aussie rules only played in Australia. They can change the rules. Really, there's no rules in Aussie rules. There's a mark. Every 10 metres you've got to touch the ground or bounce the ball, and you've got to do that, and you can't tackle above the shoulders or below the hips. That's it. That's the rules. That's why it's quick. Rugby league can change the rules tomorrow because they own the game. Rugby union's an international sport. It's like soccer. You can't change the rules of soccer. The international board controls soccer. So I think soccer's played in 140 countries. I think rugby in probably 120 countries in the world. You can't, in Australia, say, we're going to change. We are changing a few rules, but it's an international sport.
But back to now. When COVID-19 hit in 2020, all sports lost sponsors, including rugby. The Qantas Wallabies couldn't call themselves that anymore. They lost the airline that had backed them for 3 decades. It was quite a moment. So here we are. Is this it? Is this how rugby dies? Former Prime Minister John Howard isn't panicking.
I'm optimistic, and if you've got people who are keen to invest their time in it at a local level, and I mean I understand that a lot of traditional rugby schools. They're not widely... Their rugby participation is not as great as it was, but that's just the nature of the world, and you've got to accept that.
And Sherry believes, although rugby has serious problems with state versus state rivalries and the old school Blazer Brigade, it has hope.
When I left, it was different. You know, it was different to when I started. It was, as I said, when I started, there'd never been a woman on the board. Everyone only spoke about the Wallabies. There was no conversation about any other forms of rugby, about growth in participation, about community rugby. And by the time I left, that had fundamentally changed. There were thousands and thousands of women playing rugby. The sevens were there forever. The dynamic of a new generation of fans were coming through various forms of the sport. There was actually much more community rugby as well. There were boys and girls teams in country towns in parts of Australia where there hadn't been rugby before. But the fact that the participation had changed so dramatically, I thought was an opportunity to be built on. The challenge was that the revenue in, the financial stability was still an issue because of patchy performance by the franchises that are Super Rugby, and also the politics and dynamics of international rugby plays into how much money you end up with in Australian rugby. And also trying to get the international rugby tournaments lined up in a way that meant you didn't have the whole Southern Hemisphere playing each other, and the cost and the toll that took on players, and also the toll that took on the tribalism you need for sport to really work in Australia.
Hosting the World Cup in 2027 is the key. The former PM is part of a star-studded big committee which includes people like Olympic chief John Coates, Elizabeth Gaines, and is led by former Wallaby Phil Kearns, who is the CEO.
The question about the 2027 World Cup is it's a massive thing for our game. I don't know what we can make our game, but let's say it's somewhere between $100 and $150 million that we can bring into Australian rugby. Then that should secure its future forever, and nothing would give me greater joy than the ability to secure the financial future of our game and to pump some money into Grassroots and do what's important for the game.
I keep hearing talk of a big private investor swooping in to save Australian rugby. In New Zealand, that's actually happening. A private equity firm that's invested in the UFC and Manchester City is in serious talks to take a $400 million stake in New Zealand rugby's commercial arm. The All Blacks have reportedly been valued at $2 billion. Let's talk about Campo again. He'd never say this because he's too nice a guy, but I think he should be involved in coaching in elite rugby in Australia. Why isn't he? Because rugby thinks it doesn't need him, right? Today you will find him in the Sydney suburbs, coaching kids with big dreams of becoming a Wallaby, because that's who Campo is. He just wants to help people love rugby union. And I hope, Australian rugby starts to recognise your talents.
Life is what it is, I mean, it's when you got someone who's played 100 caps and coaching 6-year-olds, that's when you know you love the game. I coach 6-year-olds to whoever, so it's more about fun. It's more about enjoying and passing on some knowledge, I just want to see players understand and play well and try different things.
This has been The Breakdown, brought to you by The Australian. I'm Jessica Halloran, and this podcast was produced by Claire Harvey, with special thanks to Dylan Adams, Grace Richardson, Eric George, Stephen Samuelson, Wally Mason, and Nick Adams Jasper. Please subscribe to help us make quality journalism. Check us out at theaustralian.com.au.